everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Stephanie Marie. I'm on a mission to share people's stories to spread hope, inspire, and empower you. Today, I am blessed to welcome Dr. Meghana Nayak, who is a political science professor at Pace University, the co-founder of the Dyson's Women's Leadership Initiative there, and also the author of Tilt, that addresses the devastating histories that haunt us and the unexpected beauty of facing our past. Hello, Dr. Nayak, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel so honored. Thank you.
Today, we're going to delve deep into a very real reality that's felt by families and communities. We are talking about the subject of your novel, Tilt, which is intergenerational trauma. Dr. Nayak, can you give the audience a brief overview of the novel, what intergenerational trauma is, and how the novel addresses it head on?
First of all, this beautiful cover was made by a local artist in Brooklyn, Shira Gregory. I just want to shout her out. So Tilt is about the question of what happens when trauma wakes up and disrupts your everyday life. What happens when the answers to why you are in so much pain is in the past, but no one's around to answer it. And so I write about Kavya, who's an Indian American professor and a single mom of twin boys, and she's facing debilitating panic attacks. Flashback, she's having memories flood her, and she's not wanting to face it, but it's just tormenting her. And she finds a little bit of relief by starting to connect the dots of things her family, her ancestors went through, colonialism, casteism, colorism, but she ends up finding out more than she had bargained for. And then she's in it and she has to just get through it on the other side. And I would describe it as a very unexpected story about what I would say is incomplete healing, because sometimes that's how healing happens. There's no end of healing and everything's, everything's okay. It can be incomplete, but it is still worth it to ask, does intergenerational trauma have anything to do with my story? Some people call intergenerational trauma a legacy burden. I call it like ancestral residue. It is something that happened to somebody else. It's someone else's trauma that did not happen to you and is not yours to hold, but you're holding it anyways. And this is probably not something social sciences are prepared to really address.
I studied applied psychology and human relations.
Yeah.
And I was so surprised in multiple social science disciplines or behavioral studies as well. So little is mentioned about trauma in general, despite such extensive empirical research out there about it. Why do you think that is so? Why do you think that it is not talked about? And how is the book changing that pattern?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. I spent all this time explaining this is what intergenerational trauma is. It is complex and it is messy. It's a feeling. How do you prove that something that happened generations ago is why you're having nonstop anxiety attacks and why you have heart disease? So it's very hard for people to wrap their minds around it. So I think there are ways that psychology has to look at itself before it can theorize different forms of oppression and how it can go through the generations. Just to be very transparent.
In the book, you mentioned how unprocessed trauma stays within us and changes even our brain chemistry. And this is really essential because trauma changes the way the brain is structured and the way the brain functions. And in various ways we can talk about, but overactive stress responses, nervous system dysregulation, it can affect, even the neuroplasticity of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and how people have trouble with emotional regulation, impulse control, making decisions, decreased memory, all of these things. So I really want to talk about this essential piece of this.
Yes. It shows through Kavya's story how this can be talked about in therapy. She's someone who's very resistant to therapy, and it's kind of awkward and it's messy, but it ends up opening up all these new avenues of thinking for Kavya. And yes, there's a lot of research being done about neuroplasticity, about how, flexible plastic, like the wiring of our brain is. And there are ways that it can be wired, and then we teach that to each generation afterwards, where, as you said, it impacts how we react to stress, deal with our own emotions, impacts our memory, all of it. So there are these habitual responses. And then those start getting transmitted into the generations that come after in a few ways. One is actually through epigenetics, which is basically when there's almost like this little tag on the gene that kind of turns it off or on and has it express itself in a different way. And so you found that descendants, even like a few generations afterwards, are experiencing issues because they have those tags on their genes. And so what I tried to do was to tackle it head on by getting into the very messy parts of intergenerational trauma, about how we keep silent the things that happen in our families. And that includes how we hurt each other. We hurt each other because there's trauma there in part, and that's causing us to not know how to connect and really be with other people, because that trauma rewired our brains so that it's harder to like have compassion for the self and others. I wanted people to understand that we can talk about it without pathologizing or demonizing anyone. And there are ways in which it shows up in what has happened in her life that she never made the connections before. So as you go along Kavya's journey, you see these different connections made. You can actually see her in real time trying to rewire her brain to think differently, understand differently, and how that happens. I think it was important for me to write it as a fiction novel. My first novel, right? Like I've always written academic stuff. And I was thinking about Stephanie Foo's memoir, What My Bones Know. And there's also another fantastic Filipino American writer, Soriano, who wrote Nervous. And it's about essays on heritage and healing. And it's also about intergenerational trauma. Those are both memoirs. I wanted to see what would happen if I got kind of creative and wrote a very unexpected story. I wanted it to be accessible, anyone to pick it up and think, what's stopping me from writing fiction? Because it is very scary to talk about trauma. Not everyone's ready to go into therapy and talk about it. Okay, let me write my whole life story, even if it's never going to get published. Fiction allows you to sort of play around with the story, with the plots, with the characters, and imagine different kinds of endings and relationships. And for me, it felt like a very interesting and manageable way to talk about very difficult topics. And I hope that might be the case for other people out there too.
And it's really interesting because the book and also your work shows that there is hope for people, that just because you have these experiences or this past, you can forge and create a better future for yourself and also for the next generation as well.
Yeah.
You can make active changes towards your future.
Yes, even making active changes, it's not on us by ourselves, right? It needs to be within a community that's supporting us.
I have a question that I ask all of my guests. What role has hope played in your journey? How do you hold on to it today? And also, what role has hope played in Kavya's journey?
So Kavya has a yearning throughout the book. She just wants to feel at ease. She just wants to feel comfortable in her own skin. And she even fantasizes about what that could look like. And I think as long as someone is yearning, then that's hope, because you're like in such a desire for something else to happen. And it's actually because of Kavya, from writing her, that I realized something for myself about hope. I think probably a lot of people have heard this whole saying that hope is a discipline, right? Like it's something intentional, you have to choose it. I think that's true. I also think hope is a very undisciplined, wild, and reckless thing. I think that you can try all you can to have hope about the absolutely catastrophic things happening. And sometimes you're in such depths of despair and you kind of surrender, like, I don't know what happens next. And then that's when hope suddenly appears. I think of hope too as, I think about the people who are making the decisions that are creating so much suffering. And I know that they want us to be and feel hopeless. Not going to try to make me feel hopeless. I'm going to be defiant in my hope. I'm imagining this forward motion of like the sense of, you haven't met all the people who are going to love you. You haven't yet met all the people who are going to inspire you. You haven't yet heard all the ideas and the movements that are creating good things, that are creating change. And the more you go forward, it's like, today I might meet someone where we get to do some meaningful activism together that changes something for somebody. And so those are all the different contours of how I see hope.
It's like the beauty of the unknown.
Yeah.
Really
and
is.
It's scary. The unknown is scary, right? Especially, I think there are a lot of things to feel really terrified or in despair about when you're scared, look to the helpers. And the helpers are the ones who are like carrying the hope in motion. And when they get exhausted, someone else is taking over. And I could not be 20 years into teaching about the worst things in the world unless I saw evidence of hope like all the time, everywhere.
I think that hope is what carries us through and allows us to persevere. It's so hard to convey deep feelings of characters, and you do that in such a real, raw, organic way. As the audience, we feel like we're peering into Kavya's world and walking through the journey with her. She's processing her trauma in real time, and as you said, healing is not linear. As we talk about, therapy can be something that's not always accessible to people. So,
Yeah.
what are some other ways that you think people can process their trauma and
Yeah.
work towards healing if therapy is not the first option or the immediate thought?
Yes. I think that's such a great question because Kavya herself, she is resistant to talking about anything real in therapy. She's like, we're not going to talk about my childhood in here. It's irrelevant. And I think a lot of people just don't want to go there. I think there's a few things to do. I took inspiration from, there's an activist by the name of Kai Cheng Tom. And they do this mini somatic resilience toolkit and sort of riffing off of that of, is there a way that we can create a little toolkit where we can pull some tools out and use them when we need it? If you're just in the throes of it, if it is just intense, it's disrupting your life. Somatic movement. I know somatics, embodied work, mind-body connection, it's become very trendy, but it is a way to sort of settle the nerves without like digging in the wound too much. So there's a lot of facial bodily sensations, sounds you can make, etc., that help you tell your body we're just resting. I actually have been compiling these ongoing worksheets of all the somatic classes I've taken, everything that I've learned, and anyone is free to DM me on Instagram or reach out to me via email. I'm happy to send all of those resources to you. So there's lots of different things that you can do without having to talk about this difficult stuff. Now, when you're feeling okayish, but things are still kind of bubbling up, I think you can still do creative work and what I call curiosity work and community work. Like something's happening, you pick out a somatic movement, you pick out creative work. So I'll have a list of artistic, poetic, short story writing prompts. And sometimes we can just trust our brains to sort of work out some stuff through creative expression that we may not even be aware of that our brain is doing. And so there could be different kinds of writing prompts about like love or grief. I really recommend Alexis Gums. She does a lot of writing workshops, puts up writing prompts. And then there's what I call the curiosity work. So there's a moment where Kavya, because she's a professor, and I think there's a lot of us who are in academia, intellectualize our pain and not really feel it. I think it's okay to research our way through pain. And what I do in the book is there are ways for you to get out, like have a release valve for all the anger or hurt, where you don't, again, have to go to talk therapy. And so one thing that Kavya does, Kavya writes this scathing letter and it's all your fault, etc. It's not a letter she's going to send, but because of her research, this is how she was able to make the connections, that is able to kind of like release, get a little bit of catharsis. And then it was a little bit safer for her to then really explore, wow, how did this impact my family? And I think the last piece of this is community work, of doing meaningful work with others, of being with others maybe who had similar experiences. I have a very dear friend. She finds a lot of relief, not in therapy, but actually in volunteering with shelters. And she's building community that way. So I think that creating that little toolkit, and like I said, I have all these worksheets where I've been collecting stuff over the years that I'm happy to share with anybody.
And in the story, Kavya being a professor,
yes,
she creates this community workbook. So towards the very final pages of the book, she shares the resource that actually people can use on and for themselves and with others. That community is so important. And I think that that's an important piece as well, that you don't have to do it alone. You can, if you feel comfortable and ready, you can do it with other people. So Intergenerational trauma has been frequently referred to as a cycle. It continues and renews in subsequent generations and families. It becomes normalized, rationalized, and silenced. So,
Yes,
why do you think that is so? And how can people start to break the cycle, so to speak?
that's such a good question. I see a cycle as it's a pattern that hasn't been identified as such. It's a pattern and no one realizes they're in the pattern. It's like, a couple who they keep having the same fight over and over again because they don't realize they're in a pattern. These habitual responses, it changes or alters how people parent or are attached, and then that can cause interfamily kind of dynamics that might just be silence, never talking about anything. I really want to spell out that intergenerational trauma can also get transmitted by normalizing these habitual patterns. It's really complex, a collective emotional and psychological wounding across generations where it still is patterned. So I think it's scary, and sometimes it feels easier and more comforting to be in a bad habitual pattern than to say, whoa, what's going on here? Let's try to do something different. So how to break the cycle? There's this group called Asian Mental Health Collective, and they talked about, instead of calling it breaking the cycle, which can kind of feel like maybe we're saying that someone before us was bad and we need to break the cycle of whatever they were doing, we can say realigning cycles. And I think there's a few ways to do that. So if we're actually dealing with our own relatives, elders, there are ways in which trauma becomes the way of relating. Are there different ways of relating? Are there different ways of acknowledging sort of this ambiguous, messy grief and loss where you don't know what the elders went through? They don't know what they passed on to you. You're not understanding each other. Are there different ways to relate to each other? Are there different ways to reclaim your culture or create new practices and rituals? And if that feels too hard, especially, people are estranged from their families, or someone may be adopted and have no choice to be able to contact anyone from their birth family, or is just isolated. This goes back to what we were saying about being in a chosen community. And if your chosen community is an intergenerational community, that's where you can create new patterns of how elders, middle-aged people, young adults, children kind of interact. This can emerge in communities of activism in neighborhoods, taking care of each other. We see it in mutual aid networks. So I'm not saying that it's this easy thing, like one fine day you've broken the cycle. I think just the fact of naming, oh, this is a cycle, this is a pattern, this is trauma that is causing this. And I'm not going to blame anyone. What I'm going to say is that there are these reasons why this person or this group of people or this whole community or country even develop these habitual responses. And this is why it's being passed on. But maybe we can do something else, start a new way of reacting and relating. How do I transform intergenerational trauma, some people call it curses, into intergenerational joy and hope, and the abundance of love and healthy relating and all of that?
And growth, really,
And growth. Yes,
as
and
well.
growth.
And so the word tilt is mentioned quite in the book. It's the name of the piece.
Yeah.
And this really is in reference to how Kavya perceives her environment, her surroundings. He's also going through those feelings of abandonment and nightmares, panic attacks. So, what ultimately inspired the name choice?
I went through a lot of different titles, and for me, it was the way that I envisioned and was able to describe what a panic attack is, like not being able to stand upright. Everything seems kind of sideways. So I'll just read a couple of paragraphs. The sound of brakes squealing on the street pulled Kavya out of her maddening time traveling habit. Here she was in her own home, a college professor in New York City, far away from Texas, and she could still spend large parts of her days reliving scenes from years ago. She had long ago dubbed it the slingshot feeling. As if released by a catapult, her memories would get dislodged and flung about, splattering all over the place, and then they'd drip like paint down her insides, and she would be deep, deep within some scent or a dirty look or a face or a kiss. It was something her brain had done since she was a teenager. But what was new was the disruption of her life. The unbearable episodes when everything, the floor, her mind, her body, her dreams, the world, started to tilt and let her know that something was horribly wrong with her. When I wrote that, I didn't know what the title would be, but it was like, that's it. She's struggled with anxiety her entire life. She's not able to do her job. She's having to hide things from her family and friends. She's fearing that her life is over because of the terror that's taken over her. Everything's tilting in a way where you're like, uh-oh, something's off. Something very, very bad is happening here. Decide to call it that moment when trauma awakens, and it's like, okay, you're going to look at me. You're going to have a nice long look at me and try to figure out what's going on.
It's almost like she tries to tilt in the opposite direction. She tries to come back to this homeostasis in a sense. So I find that interesting.
Yes.
And I want to also talk about each chapter is divided into seasons. What really inspired that design choice?
Your insight into she tries to tilt the other way. She's a pendulum. She goes the other way of like shutting down or lying. She's a very complex character. So I think that was a really great observation. So funnily enough, when I was writing this novel, each section ended up getting written during that particular season. I don't know why or how, it just did. And then it struck me that healing is not linear. There are periods where there's some growth. There are periods of death of old ideas and identities. There's hibernation. Then new things come up, and it can be kind of unpredictable, right? There's always going to be these waves in healing where if it's hitting a low, it'll kind of come back up again. The last thing that I would say is why I decided to make Kavya a professor. So in some ways, it's because academia is something I know very well. It's been my workplace for over 20 years. And I wanted to show that, intergenerational trauma can seep into any place. I see my students and trauma is just alive. Those of us in academia who say, we want change, we want to do the kinds of things that end the kind of stuff that causes trauma. So you see in the book, there's lots of interpersonal ways in which we really damage each other. So it is very hard to talk about those big scale changes if we aren't able to make those changes on a smaller level. And so that's why I explored her work as being a professor. Just wanted to share that piece.
And that's interesting because she also kind of like sees herself through her students and she really wants to help them. And I think also helping others is a way for us to help ourselves too, because maybe sometimes it's hard to see in our own selves. And then I think in a way that kind of helps our growth too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought that was really beautiful, the experience that she tries to give back to her students too.
Yeah,
I love that.
Well, my students are the ones who inspire everything that I do. So, and I love teaching. I just felt like this was also an homage to teaching and the really wonderful things that come out of teaching.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nayak, for a wonderful discussion. I know so many can learn so much from this book and also the work that you're doing and the resources that you're providing and gathering for people. So thank you so much for having this wonderful discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
If this message has resonated with you, please be sure to like, share, subscribe to stay updated for weekly episodes on this channel. I will have the link to the book Tilt as well as Dr. Nayak's website linked down below for you to engage further in her research, resources, and tools. Thank you, Dr. Nayak, and thank you for listening. Have a fabulous day. Bye.